Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming right up with special guest, Cynthia Hayes. And she's here to share with us her new book, The Big Ordeal, Understanding and Managing the Psychological Turmoil of Cancer. Cynthia is a former journalist, hospital executive, and cancer survivor who currently advocates for and mentors cancer patients through various initiatives. She's been preparing her whole life to write The Big Ordeal. She learned the basics of interviewing, synthesizing information, finding the headlines, and telling a story as a journalist early in her career. After a brief interruption to earn her MBA from Harvard Business School, she spent 25 years as a management consultant. In that role, success depended on her ability to jump into new topics, ask sensitive questions, understand specialized information, and turn complex findings into a compelling narrative. So let's welcome to the show, Cynthia Hayes.
Thank you, Marianne. It is just delightful to be here.
You know, what an honor it is to have you here. And I have to ask, why did you feel that now was the right time for this book?
Well, I think that any time is the right time for this book because people are being diagnosed with cancer every day. And there are so many people going through a cancer experience in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of getting on with their lives, in the midst of trying to do what they need to do every day. And for every day, it's really a good time to be releasing this book.
Well, I know in your book you share about this, but I'd love for you to also share with our listeners a little bit about your personal experience with cancer.
Sure. I was diagnosed 5 years ago with endometrial cancer, and the particular type of endometrial cancer that I had was a high-grade, very aggressive cancer. Needless to say, I was scared out of my wits. I was 57 years old, which is on the younger side for cancer, although, obviously still a mature adult. And everything that I imagined about cancer made the cancer experience that much scarier. After surgery and 6 months of chemo, my doctor said there's no evidence of disease. It's time to get back to living your life. But I actually found that process of recovery to be challenging. And I was surprised as I started speaking with other cancer patients that they too had a very emotional response to being cancer patients, and that they too had a hard time getting beyond the treatment phase of cancer to move into recovery and feeling like themselves again. And that's really what prompted me to write the book, was that there's so much about cancer that is an unspoken reality that we share as cancer patients, but we don't know going into the experience, and therefore we feel like we are alone with our emotions, when in fact there's so much support out there if only we knew to ask for it.
Yeah, it's interesting once you go through this type of an experience, as you're saying, the doctors say, okay, you're good, you can go ahead and live your life. And for a lot of people, this new normal is something that they're just trying to develop and experience.
Well, that's right. And it's a combination of physical recovery and emotional recovery. When the doctor says, okay, go back and live your life, you've completed your treatment, but your body hasn't yet recovered from the insult of the cancer, the surgery, the chemo, the immunotherapy, the radiation, whatever it is you've been through. And that can take a year or more to begin to resolve. And then there's the emotional recovery of, well, who am I, and what just happened to me, and how do I get back to being a productive member of society when I have had these, physical and emotional assaults over the past, set of months or years or whatever it's been. So it's a very complicated process, and human beings generally are resilient, and I think we surprise ourselves with our ability to get through what we need to get through. But often it's after we're through all of those treatments and physical side effects that we allow ourselves to feel the emotional impact of what we've been through.
What were some of the things that you discovered that were surprising for many people as far as emotions go?
Well, I think the thing that was almost universal was a sense of fear and anxiety at the time of diagnosis. And I think that, historically, cancer has always been a death sentence. And more and more today, it's not, because the ability to diagnose the cancer early and the range of treatments means that people don't automatically die when they get cancer. But that's still the fear that we've all grown up with. And so that fear and anxiety and facing one's mortality is a nearly universal experience that we don't anticipate at the time that we're first diagnosed. I think another thing that is really surprising is the degree to which we feel fatigue, just incredible bone fatigue throughout the experience. That the emotional assaults and the physical assaults just create this incredible tiredness that makes it impossible for us to get on with our lives during treatment and recovery. And then, the chemo brain and the neuropathy and all of these other little things that people are surprised with end up affecting sort of our sense of self. And so that a lot of patients actually wonder, who am I? They look in the mirror and they don't look the same. They don't feel the same. Their brain is not functioning at the same level that they were used to. And so there's a cognitive dissonance that, I know it's still me, but I don't feel like me. And then lastly, unfortunately, a number of patients actually experience depression and PTSD as a result of their cancer. And many people experience PTSD in minor ways, in what we refer to as scanxiety. That, that scan when I was diagnosed with cancer was so traumatic that every time I have to go back and get another test, another scan, another blood test, another mammogram, I experience all over again that same anxiety. And for some people, it just stays at scan time. And for others, it's a full-on, PTSD response and a very challenging emotional situation to recover from.
Yeah, I can see where that would be just really kind of all encompassing. And it has me kind of wondering. I know you mentioned, you talk about these things in your book in regards to how this experience is for partners and caregivers as well.
Yes. And it's really complicated, I think, being a partner or a caregiver to somebody who is going through cancer, because the patient, for the most part, is very busy with cancer. Your brain is engaged on, what do I need to do to get well? Your body is focused on, how am I going to get through this? And your emotions are all just geared towards, what do I have to do? How am I going to make it through? But the caregiver is thinking about, well, what if she doesn't survive? And of course, the cancer patient is very worried about that as well. But the caregiver is thinking about, from the standpoint of, how do I keep the household going? How do I take care of the kids? How do I get the dog fed? How do I treat how do I interact with the cancer patient? How do I know what my loving cancer patient is actually feeling and going through? And how do I deal with, I've got to be at the office and work because I need to keep the insurance going so that we can cover this cancer care. So there can be a lot of additional things that a loving caregiver is worried about, allowing the cancer patient to really focus on just getting well. And sometimes those differences in focus and emotional awareness allows there to be a gap between the patient and his or her partner that can lead to an increase in challenges with intimacy, both emotional intimacy and physical intimacy. And I think, we, as couples, we go through periods of, distance and closeness and distance and closeness. And that's sort of the ebbs and flow of any relationship. But cancer creates some additional challenges that we often don't think about going into the experience, and then have to deal with in the middle or after the experience. I had one cancer patient recount a story of her ongoing challenges with cancer, and it kept coming back and was not going away and whatnot. And her husband actually lost patience and said, what the hell? Why can't you just get well already? And of course, it wasn't that he had really run out of empathy. It was that his needs were not being met as he was continuing to try and meet her needs. And those are the kinds of things that come up that we don't anticipate going into the experience that we'll have to deal with.
Do you find that sometimes partners get a little bit angry because, someone's going through a cancer situation and their needs aren't getting met?
I think that anger is not an uncommon emotion for patients or their partners. I am familiar with other patients who, absolutely rail against the cancer and the nerve of, and how is it that it's possible that I got cancer? But also so many partners who are angry, that their needs aren't being met, or that their partner didn't take better care of themselves to prevent the cancer, or isn't taking better care of himself now that he's been diagnosed with cancer. So I think that anger is a typical emotion during cancer on all sides, and it really springs often from our inability to regain a sense of control. I think one of the illusions we all have to deal with in life is that we have control over our lives. And in fact, we don't. And we can do the right thing, and we can, stop smoking and eat a healthy diet and exercise every day. But that doesn't mean we can really control what's going on in our bodies. There are so many factors that contribute to the mutations that are happening all of the time in our cells, and so many factors that contribute to the strength or weakness of our immune system and its ability to deal with those mutations. And we would like to think we have control over that, but we really don't. And that's where a lot of the anger comes from.
Was there anything that surprised you as you were going through your own cancer experience?
I was obviously very surprised at the diagnosis, because how could this be happening? But I was surprised also by sort of the blasé attitude that many of the folks in the medical profession took towards cancer. And granted, they deal with cancer every day, whereas we as cancer patients, this is the first time we're going through it. So some of the things that I was very concerned about, my medical team sort of said, oh, yeah, well, that might happen, and, you might feel this way or you might feel that way. But because they're so focused on eradicating the cancer, it's very hard for them to actually be in the moment with a cancer patient and remember the fear and the anxiety and the potential for side effects and how long it can take to recover. And so I was surprised by some of that. And in fact, one of my doctors is a co-author and wrote the foreword to my book. And she was surprised by all of my questions, many of which she didn't have answers for. And that's, sort of what prompted my digging and some of the initial research on the book was, well, why don't doctors know this? Why don't they understand this? Why don't they think about this? And therefore, how can we help other patients not have to go through the same lack of information and feeling lost that I did?
Yeah, there's so much there to take into consideration. I'm sure it was kind of a little bit of an education, as she's reading the book and going through it.
Yes, I think that's right. And of course, many patients feel like we go, from, as one of my patients said, from zero to PhD in a matter of days and weeks as we're trying to get our arms around what we might want to know about our cancer and our treatment. And I think that on the flip side, the medical community is often trying to get to know us as people in lightning speed. For most patients, your oncology team is not doctors that you knew before your diagnosis, but rather they're new to you and you are new to them as patients. And so establishing that relationship and understanding how to communicate with your doctor, understanding their proclivities and helping them understand your proclivities in terms of what information do I want to know? How much of this am I prepared to deal with? And what questions do I feel comfortable asking? Are they going to respond if I ask, or are they going to offer the information? I mean, there's so much we have to negotiate as new patients in that doctor-patient relationship. And we're all different in what we want to know and are prepared to deal with.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't even realize some of the stats as far as when people are diagnosed with cancer, how many people this is really an end-of-life journey for them.
Well, I think that's right. I think we all, tend to fear cancer, and there are cancers that do tend to recur and do tend to lead to end-of-life situations. But many more cancers these days are treatable, and sometimes they become, chronic. Not that they ever truly go away, but many more cancers are addressable with the treatments that are available today, and yet we all assume that death sentence.
So I know we've already talked about caregivers, but I'd love for you to expand on this discussion. I think it's so important. A lot of times people put themselves at the bottom of the list as far as taking care of themselves. So what are some of the warning signs they should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because, like they always say on the airplane, you have to put your own oxygen mask on first before helping somebody else. And that's so true for caregivers as well, because if we're not taking care of ourselves as caregivers, we don't have the resilience to take care of the patient. So an increase in anger or shortness of patience is obviously a sign that we need to pull back and do a little bit more self-care. But also, some people want to do it all for themselves. They want to be the only one that the cancer patient is dependent on. And I think a tendency to try to control the situation is also another sign that maybe you do need a little bit more support. Obviously, finding it difficult to sleep, finding it difficult to do what needs to get done, finding it difficult to pay the bills. These are all signs that it's time to be reaching out. And there are so many excellent caregiver support resources available in addition to patient support resources available.
So what does a new normal look like for someone that's going through a cancer treatment?
That's an interesting question. And I think that there's sort of a split as people recover from cancer. Some people can't wait to get back to their old lives. And after the initial, period of physical recovery, they just want to snap right back to who they were. And one friend of mine who recovered from breast cancer said, it's not that I am any different than I was before. I'm just maybe more so, meaning that the cancer helped her become more aware of who she was and what her values were and what was important to her. And it helped her remember those things and act on them more concretely. But I know a number of patients that found that the cancer experience created a totally new normal for them, where having been through something so life-threatening and life-altering, they now wanted to give back and find new meaning in their life, and changed a lot about their lives. One woman I know divorced her husband. A couple of women started not-for-profit organizations. One man I know, changed his job and said, I don't want to do something this stressful anymore. So people can have very different responses to the experience. I think it's unusual for someone to go through cancer and not have an appreciation for that was a scary thing. How do I ensure that I don't have to go through anything like that ever again? And they make subtle or grand changes around that.
I think one of the things that I walked away from reading your book was just the emotional aspect, how many people just don't understand, the emotions that come with a cancer diagnosis.
I agree. I think that's, for me, that was one of the real eye openers. I know that I felt a great deal of fear and anxiety and so isolated in those emotions. I couldn't imagine that anyone else could possibly understand what I was going through. And I think that one of the things that I'm hopefully accomplishing with the book is to just raise awareness of the fact that cancer is an emotional diagnosis. And there are physical and physiological reasons for some of that emotion, as well as, of course, the fear and the cultural stigma associated with cancer. What surprised me as I started speaking with first psychologists and then neuroscientists was that many of the things that occur in our bodies as a result of cancer, as a result of surgery, as a result of chemo and radiation and immunotherapy, actually create chemical changes in our body that lead to chemical changes in our brains that increase our emotional volatility. In the news lately, we've been hearing a lot about cytokines as they relate to COVID. Well, when you get, our bodies have pro-inflammatory cytokines and anti-inflammatory cytokines, and they are generally kept in balance. But, if you get a paper cut, the pro-inflammatory cytokines go to the site of your paper cut in order to encourage your body to start the healing process. So, of course, major surgery, you're going to get a lot of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Chemotherapy causes a release of pro-inflammatory cytokines, as does radiation. Some immunotherapies actually are pro-inflammatory cytokines. Well, just as there can be a cytokine storm in COVID, the imbalance of pro-inflammatory cytokines in the body can lead to what neuroscientists refer to as sickness behavior, where all we want to do is climb back into bed and pull the covers up over our heads. And that's good because we need to recover our strength and we need to heal. And so we need to rest. But it's also when it's thoroughly imbalanced, that's what can lead to depression. And that's what increases our anxiety. And so the combination of the stress hormones and the cytokines in our bodies can just create so much emotional turmoil for us. And yet, because we don't talk about this, in large part because mental health issues are stigmatized, as is cancer, patients don't know going into the experience that it is perfectly normal to feel these emotions. It's an expected part of the cancer experience. And that's why there is such a vast network of support available to cancer patients. But because patients don't know to ask about this, and doctors tend to be so focused on, let's just get rid of that cancer, that often there isn't the recognition that, hey, this treatment might make you feel absolutely miserable and depressed. You should know that these support systems are available to you if that occurs. And of course, as I said, we're stigmatized to think that expressing any type of emotional volatility is a sign of weakness. And we need to be strong, particularly, if we're fighting cancer, we need to be strong. And so that sort of clouds the water as we're trying to recover from cancer.
I really feel like books like yours and having discussions like this really help shed the light on mental health, and especially when it comes to treatments like this, because I would think that it's such a fine line between allowing your body to heal and process and then getting into depression about what you've been told as a diagnosis. And so there's got to be like this balance where people are like, okay, maybe I've crossed over into depression, but this is normal and I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it is a fine line. We know that exercise helps people recover. But, that doesn't mean you should get up and start, running a marathon a week after, surgery. We know that, yoga and meditation and mindfulness can help quiet some of the emotions. But how much is enough? How much is too much? When do you start? And as you said, is it depression that is okay and helping me get the rest I need, or is it depression that's interfering with my ability to get the rest that I need and my ability to get on with my life? And how do I fine tune that so that I know when to seek help? And I think that in general, we don't do a very good job about talking about mental health issues, and that makes it harder for patients to know when is the right time to ask for help. And of course, my answer to that is any time is the right time to ask for help. Any time is the right time to be reaching out and saying, "Oh my God, I'm so depressed. Oh my God, I can't deal with this. How do I get through the next scan when I am afraid I'm going to hear more bad news? How do I deal with my anger at the fact that my cancer has progressed? How do I deal with a sense of guilt that I've allowed myself to recur?" And there's so many complex emotions, and there's never a wrong time to reach out and ask for help.
Do you find when someone's going through a reoccurrence of cancer that they go right back through all these emotions and feelings, or are they a little bit more prepared?
That's an interesting question because I think for some people they do feel a little bit more prepared, but I think it depends on the dialogue that they have had with their medical professionals as well as with themselves around the possibility of recurrence. Uh, Many times doctors will say, "Well, okay, you're cured," when in fact what they really mean is, "Well, there's no evidence of disease right now. That doesn't mean it won't come back later." And so if we're promised a cure and then we recur, we tend to be very angry. Whereas if we're promised there's no evidence of disease right now, and your cancer has a low incidence of recurrence or your cancer has a high incidence of recurrence, we begin to manage our expectations a little differently. And I do think it's all about managing those expectations. At a certain point, people say, "Well, you've made it to 5 years, you're good." And there's nothing really magical about that 5 year mark other than that's what has been tested over the years. When you look at research studies on, is this treatment better than that treatment? They only look at the treatment over the period of 5 years. For most treatments, treatments that have been around for a long time, they can measure effectiveness beyond the 5 years. But before a treatment becomes sort of part of the protocol, it's been assessed for 5 years. Well, that doesn't mean that the cancer won't recur, on day one of year 6, or 15 years later. And we hear these things as promises as opposed to likelihoods, and assuming a promise when one isn't really or shouldn't really be applied can lead to a lot of anger and distress when in fact the cancer comes back.
Yeah, it sounds like that really helps, kind of pinpoint how important words are when we have these types of discussions with our healthcare workers, the doctors and nurses that we're seeing. So maybe, there just needs to be a little bit of re-education as far as the language to be using.
Well, I think that's right. And I think that a lot of the language around cancer makes it hard for cancer patients. 50 years ago, when we started the war on cancer, that was meant to be an all-out investment in finding the cure for cancer. It wasn't meant to mean that each one of us is fighting in a battle for our lives. It was meant to say doctors need to take responsibility for curing. Researchers need to take responsibility for finding a cure for cancer. Not that we as individuals were guilty of failing if treatment didn't work. But to this day, you'll find doctors who say, well, she failed treatment. No, she didn't fail treatment. Treatment failed her. We talk about the pink battle and everybody out there, battling cancer. Well, that can be really hard for patients, because then they feel like if they quote unquote lose their battle, that it was their own fault, as opposed to the fault of science and medicine. So there's a lot about the language of cancer and how we talk about cancer that makes it harder for patients rather than supporting them. And that said, there are plenty of patients who find that the battle language actually encourages them, that they feel victorious when they have made it through their treatment and get to the point of no evidence of disease. So, again, it's a challenge, because patient and oncology relationships are formed just at the time of diagnosis. And so the patient and the doctor don't necessarily know how to communicate with one another and what language is going to work best for this particular patient. It takes a great deal of empathy on the part of the medical team and openness on the part of the patient to really negotiate that.
Yeah, there's a lot that needs to take place there. And that's why your book, The Big Ordeal, is such a great resource for people that maybe are finding themselves at the beginning of this journey or somewhere in the journey and not quite sure how to navigate all that. Cynthia, where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your book and be part of your community?
Well, thank you for asking that, Marianne. You can find a lot of information on my website, the-big-ordeal.com. And there'll be a link there as well for purchasing the book. There's an opportunity to communicate directly with me through that website, as well as to read stories of patients and caregivers who have been through cancer and have shared their experiences, and some insights from the research that I've done with various experts in the field, coping insights to help you get through the cancer experience.
Well, Cynthia, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, it was my pleasure, Marianne, and I do hope that the Big Ordeal finds its way into the hands of folks that can really benefit from its information.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, The Big Ordeal. The Big Ordeal is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. And of course, it's available on Kindle. Again, if you'd like to connect with Cynthia, you can at the-big-ordeal.com for more information. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.